Hi everyone, welcome back to Newegg TV. My name is Paul and I'm here today to talk about Sandy Bridge E. This is the recently released line of processors from Intel. Sandy Bridge E is the code name. Specifically, they are Intel's second generation Core i7 processors on the 2011 socket. They're also supported by motherboards featuring the X79 chipset, and the good folks at Intel were kind enough to send me over a couple engineering samples of these processors. This one right here is the 3930K, just like that one in the box, and they also have an engineering sample of the 3960X. I've done some benchmarking of the 3960X, so I wanted to share those numbers with you, and also give you my personal review of both the Sandy Bridge E line of processors, as well as the new X79 platform. So for the benchmarking, here is a quick look at my test bed, and for starters, I'm using an ASRock X79 Extreme 7 motherboard, and installed right here. And right over here, I have Corsair Vengeance, a 16 gigabyte, 4x4 gigabyte memory kit. That's 1600 megahertz speed. For my storage, and with Windows loaded onto it, I have a Samsung 830 series, 256 gigabyte SSD. For video purposes, I'm using a couple Asus GTX 580 DirectCU2 video cards. Those are set up in SLI right now. For the processor, of course, I'm using that i7-3960X. Bear in mind that that is an engineering sample as opposed to the retail box version that I have right there. For cooling, I'm going with an air cooling solution right now. I'll be testing out some water cooling solutions later on, but for now I just wanted to see how it does on air. So that is actually a Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo. Now the Evo out of the box does not come with a 2011 kit, so if you contact Cooler Master, actually if you have a Hyper 212 Evo, I believe also a Hyper 212 Plus, but you might want to call Cooler Master to verify that. They will send you this Socket 2011 retention bracket, and then you can use that air cooler on the Socket 2011 socket. And that pretty much wraps it up. Oh, and just to make sure I do not run out of juice, around here we have a Thermaltake Toughpower 1350 watt power supply because, well, we're running a couple GTX 580s, and also when overclocking the 3960X, you will definitely bypass that 130 watt thermal envelope, and you might hit upwards of 180, even up to 200 watts just for the CPU. So now that you guys have seen my testbed hardware setup, let's move on to the benchmarks. And I wanted to say a quick note about benchmarks, that being that there are different types of benchmarks that you might want to run. There are the benchmarks that test day-to-day use and see what sort of benefits you get from different hardware or different overclocking settings when you're generally using your computer to do normal stuff like playing video games. And then there are synthetic benchmarks which can really see what is the maximum performance that's attainable for the CPU depending on the tasks that are sent to it. What we have here are three benchmarks that I ran that are more towards the synthetic side. Well, they are synthetic benchmarks because I wanted to show what sort of performance gap there is between the new Sandy Bridge E processors and the last line of processors that were available. So we ran Cinebench, ran Pcmark 7, and ran the Passmark performance test just to get a gauge of that. Also, I did an overclock on the CPU, so I ran all three tests at the stock speed of 3.3 gigahertz with the 3.9 gigahertz turbo boost. And I also set up a 4.6 gigahertz turbo boost setting as well. And I wanted to talk a little bit about overclocking with Sandy Bridge E because it is slightly different than Sandy Bridge. With Sandy Bridge, you had the base clock generator, which ran at 100 megahertz. You could get plus or minus maybe 3 to 5 megahertz out of that, so you could maybe go up to about 105 total. Not really a whole lot. Most of the overclocking there was multiplier based. Fortunately, with Sandy Bridge E, there is a buffer chip that separates the rest of the hardware on the motherboard with the CPU and the memory. So you can actually set a different base clock setting for the CPU and for the memory than the rest of the hardware, which keeps you from messing up the timings of the rest of the stuff while having greater overclocking capabilities with your CPU as well as your memory. Now you can set different ratios for that base clock, using this method, and you can, for instance, do 1.25, which sets the base clock to 125 megahertz. Now, this obviously will require more voltage and generates more heat, so depending on the cooling solution you use, you may or may not want to get into that. Since I'm using a fairly basic air cooling solution, I just did a multiplier-based overclock to 46, which gave me a 4.6 gigahertz overclock, set a few more settings in there, and I'm happy to say that thermally speaking, I did not really get too hot when running any of these benchmarks. That being said, let's take a look at the numbers. So we'll start off with Passmark, which is a pretty basic overall computer performance benchmark, and my overall rating here was 3,561.2. This is at the standard clock speed of 3.9 gigahertz. I'd like to specifically point out the CPU mark rating, which is right here. On the left side, I've set up the Passmark aggregate scores, where you can see lots of different processors and the different scores that they have. My CPU mark score was 14,208. There actually is a 3960X benchmark that's already up on the Passmark site of 12,989. So I was able to surpass that even at stock speeds. And here going down the line, you can see all of the rest of the scores aggregate again that Passmark has in its database. Now I also wanted to show you my overclock scores for Passmark, and definitely jumped up quite a bit, 4,634.4 overall score. And again, my CPU mark test here, 18,156.1, which significantly above the score for the 3960X there already at stock, and specifically they have the 990X here, for example, scoring just under 11,000. Also, I'd like to point out my temperatures during this test. The CPU package overall hit 68 degrees Celsius, and the hottest any of the single cores got was 67 degrees Celsius. Next up, we have Pcmark 7 Advanced Edition, and this is a FutureMark benchmark. It's an overall PC benchmark from the same folks that bring you 3D Mark 11. Overall score for the system was 4,934, and the specific computation score here was 5,674. And Pcmark 7 and its basic settings was really barely able to break a sweat for the 3960X. Hit 46 degrees Celsius on the CPU package, and the hottest core got up to 44 degrees Celsius. By comparison, once overclocked, I hit an overall score of 5,513. My computation score jumped up to 6,951. So you can see a marked increase in performance with the 4.6 gigahertz overclock. However, you also see a marked increase in temperature. So I got up to 67 degrees Celsius for the CPU package, and the hottest core got up to 64, running Pcmark 7 at 4.6 gigahertz. And our last benchmark is Cinebench. This is Cinebench 11.5, which uses your CPU specifically to render a very high-definition 3D image. Overall score here, and this is once again at stock, was 10.54. And again, CPU temperatures did not get up very high. We hit 47 degrees on the core, on the package, and 45 degrees on a few different CPU cores. Once again, when we move over to our overclock scores, we can see a bump in performance as well as heat generated. I was able to get up to 13.51 points, which is a pretty big jump going from 3.9 to 4.6 gigahertz on the turbo boost. But once again, we saw temperatures significantly higher. We hit up to 72 degrees Celsius on the package and 70 degrees on a few of the individual cores. And that's going to wrap it up for the benchmarks. In closing, I would like to remind everyone that Intel classifies their processors as mainstream and enthusiast. Right now, the active platforms are Sandy Bridge, which is the mainstream platform, and Sandy Bridge E, which is the enthusiast platform. Sandy Bridge is also going to get an update in 2012 where you will have Ivy Bridge processors that will drop into your current socket 1155 motherboards. BIOS update might be required. But if you're a typical computer user, you use your computer for internet browsing, for playing back media and movies, and probably if you're watching the Newegg YouTube channel for gaming, then you're probably not going to see a huge amount of benefit from going with the Sandy Bridge E platform. This is going to get a lot better performance numbers if you're doing stuff like enterprise applications, fluid dynamics if you're doing video editing, rendering, or encoding, if you're doing Photoshop with large raw files, or if you're doing other types of those really high-level CPU compute intensive applications. Your typical day-to-day computer use and your typical gaming use will only see a slight bump from going with Sandy Bridge E. That being said, if you do want that raw, bleeding-edge performance, you want to hit those benchmark numbers that are as fast as they can possibly be right now, this is definitely the platform to go with, and the 3960X is the CPU that you will want. Of course, this is a price no object option, so bear that in mind and stay within your budget, of course. A lot of people ask me what I personally use, and right now I have a 2500K at home, which I have overclocked and which works just fine for me with my recent foray into Battlefield 3. That's going to wrap it up for today's video. We hope you've enjoyed, and if you'd like to see more tech videos, please head over to our Newegg YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more tech videos just like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.